Ayo, back at it again with another video. Thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it. So, I haven't done a Ukraine update video in a while. It is January the 19th, 2025, so I believe this is the first one I'm doing of the new year. I honestly can't remember at this point. But last update video I did, if we look at the map, not a whole lot has changed around Kursk, not a whole lot has changed around Vovchansk. I talked a little bit about Kupiansk in my last video. I talked a lot about Kurakove, and I also talked a lot about Velika Novosilka in my last video. So, if we look at the map, if we zoom out, situation around Velika Novosilka is not great. Not great at all. Kurakove was looking really bad, but now that it looks like the Ukrainians have pulled back some. I'll get to those in a second, but if we zoom out, so basically the border of the Donbass, so we have the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts. So basically the only thing that the Russians have left in the Donbass is capture the rest of this Kurakove, Velika Novosilka, and then Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. So there hasn't been a whole lot of movement in the Zaporizhia direction, the Kherson direction, fighting sporadically across the banks of the Dnieper. Not a whole lot of movement, but I do want to dive in to Velika Novosilka if my computer would just work with me for a little bit. So Velika Novosilka in my last video, it wasn't as an encirclement as it was last time. It looks like the Russians are enclosing their hold on the settlement, pushed northwards, and it's looking like there is pretty much an encirclement around the settlement. So if you're able to push from the west and link up, that would be an encirclement. That would be essentially the town, in all intensive purposes, is under Russian control. It's not all red on the map, but for all intensive purposes, Velika Novosilka has essentially fallen to Russian forces. So if you look at the situation around Kurakove, so Kurakove is now fully under Russian control. The last time I made a video, the salient or the bulge was, I think, somewhere along in this area of the front. So it wasn't completely taken over, but it was encircled. Kurakove, the Russians have made a thrust from Kurakove, looking like they're trying to doing small pincer movements. Not super successful, but if the Russians are pushing along, I don't know if this is a creek, a riverbed, I'm not sure, but it looks like they're trying to ultimately take this settlement of Ulakli. I have no idea how to pronounce that, but it looks like they're trying to encircle what's left of Ukrainian forces. So the Ukrainian situation around Kurakove is not great. Kurakove fell to Russian forces. The situation around Velika Novosilka is not great either, but if you can pull forces back and ultimately make the line something along this front, you pull back from Velika Novosilka, you pull back around this bulge in the line around Kurakove. It looks like that's ultimately what's probably going to happen, because the Russians are starting to make multiple different pushes. One here, one here, one here. So the situation around Kurakove is not great. The Ukrainians have fallen back. Kurakove is now under Russian control. Velika Novosilka is essentially under Russian control. It's essentially encircled. It's still under Ukrainian control, but essentially it's only a matter of time before it falls to Russian forces. Okay, let's talk about Pokrovsk. So Pokrovsk is a major road and rail logistics hub for the Ukrainians, because if you look at the map, two major roads bisect here. So if you look at the road network from Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Pavlograd, ultimately there's a lot of roads in here. This one's a big one. The Russians are really, really close to really cutting this road network off, because if you look at the, that's maybe 1.5 kilometers, because the Russians are able to push and that 1.5 kilometers and sever that road link there. And if you look at the Russians to the west of Pokrovsk, that's a little bit more of a distance. That's about 5 kilometers. But that would still put that road under artillery fire. You could potentially get that under fire control for the Russians, and if the Russians are able to do that and ultimately hamper Ukrainian logistics, either at the western point of Pokrovsk or eastern section of Pokrovsk, somewhere over in this direction, that would put Pokrovsk in major trouble. It looks like the Russians are kind of have a force here trying to push west of the city and try and sever that road link. Ukrainians are trying to hold this road link, because if you look at the map, that is a road and rail hub that can get Ukrainian troops and supplies to other parts of the front, around Toretsk, around Chasiv Yar, around this section of the front. Because if this section of the front can't get logistically supplied from this direction, then the Ukrainians would have to find another way of supplying troops and equipment and personnel and material different direction. So the situation around Pokrovsk is becoming a little more critical by the day. If the Russians are able to sever this road link, then I would classify the situation around Pokrovsk as critical. Because if you're able to either sever the road link in either one or multiple places, then that would put Pokrovsk in serious jeopardy. Because you can't then resupply along that road link. You would have to figure out how to do it somehow elsewhere. So then that would hamper Ukrainian logistics and essentially would seal Pokrovsk's fate, and then the Russians could then turn their attention towards Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, which essentially is the last major hub in the Donbass for the Russians. The Russians are able to... Essentially, this is what was happening at the beginning of the war, this darker red, this almost purple-like color. Ukrainians were holding on to places like Volodar, places like Avdiivka, very, very strong defensive positions. Once those two fell, the Russians have been able to push further into the Donbass. Alright, one more part along the line I want to talk about. So it looks like the Russians haven't made a whole lot of progress in this direction. I did talk about Kupiansk, because if the Ukrainians are forced to withdraw out of this pocket, out of this bulge, then they would have nowhere else to go but across the Oskil Reservoir, the river, this body of water, back towards Kupiansk. So it looks like the Russians are trying to make movement across the body of water to the north of Kupiansk. It looks like they're trying to make a push south. If Kupiansk, is under threat, then that's a bad situation for the Ukrainians in this area, because if they're able to put Kupiansk under fire control, then that would hamper any possible retreat across, that body of water. Because the Ukrainians are surrounded on 3 sides, and the only side they have to retreat to is back towards Kupiansk. So the Russians have basically Senkove pretty much under their control. Looks like the Russians are trying to ultimately push the Ukrainians back. The Russians are making a thrust towards Borova. A little bit of a thrust here, a little bit of a thrust there. Some minor ones here and there, but it looks like this side of the Oskol River, the Oskol Reservoir, is not looking good for the Ukrainians, especially in this bulge right here. But if the Russians are able to push towards Borova, then that would put the rest of this territory on this side of the Oskol Reservoir under a certain degree of pressure. So if you remember from the Ukrainian counteroffensive around Kharkiv, you have Izium, Liman, and the other big one was Kupiansk, because those were all logistics hubs. If you look at Kupiansk, you have major roads and network. Izium as well. Liman is another one that was pretty important for the Ukrainians to retake, because it ultimately allowed them a hub around Slovyansk to push men and material to the front. But it looks like the Russians are trying to make an advance around Ivanivka, but that's only a very small and very minor thrust. So this part of the line around Kupiansk, around Borova, I would consider pretty critical for the Ukrainians, because you're surrounded on 3 sides by Russian forces. Looks like the Russian forces are trying to push towards Borova. So in this part of the line, I would consider that critical for the Ukrainians, just because the situation does not look good. Another part where I would say it's critical: Pokrovsk, Kurakove, and Velika Novosilka. Velika Novosilka and Kurakove are small, minor settlements, but a major city like Pokrovsk is like this. Russian thrust here is definitely concerning, because if the Russians are able to, cut that road link, then that could hamper Ukrainian logistics coming from the Dnieper River, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, through that road and rail link from Pokrovsk and towards the front around Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, New York, Nelipivka. So that thrust right there is concerning. It doesn't look like a whole lot, but if you look at the broader map, and if they're able to push that 1 kilometer, 2 kilometer stretch to the road, that would not be a good situation for the Ukrainians. And if the Russians are able to sever that road in 2 spots, that would make it even worse. So Velika Novosilka is essentially under Russian control. It's still being held by Ukrainian forces, but essentially it's under Russian control. Kurakove, the situation around Kurakove is not great for the Ukrainians, but definitely the situation around Pokrovsk is of major concern to me, because that whole situation around Pokrovsk does not look great. So with that, end of the video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Deuces.